Great deck building in Yu-Gi-Oh! Truly is an art. It's something I'm not just a fan of, but I often find awe-inspiring. To be honest, one of my favorite things in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is seeing a weird deck on paper and thinking to myself, how the heck does this even work? As I slowly attempt to dissect and decipher just what makes it tick. The 5Ds era was truly a deck builder's paradise. Plant Synchro, Teledad, Synchro Cats, all amazing decks that were built from the ground up and refined by brilliant minds in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community, not spoon-fed to us by Konami. The 5Ds era was known for its popular powerhouse synchro decks, and in this video we're going to cover one of the coolest creations from that era that's been all but forgotten. A deck that was absolutely magnificent from a creative standpoint, how it rose to the heights of the competitive metagame, and how it was absolutely devastated for one of the most inexplicable reasons. This is the story of the dreaded Fish OTK. Despite this being a Synchro Shokin deck, we actually have to go back to the very end of the GX era to begin our story. After all, that's where the star of the deck was released. I've done many stories that revolve around Phantom Darkness, but one of the things that never ceases to amaze me is just how many incredible non-dark monsters came out of that set. Cyber Valley, Lonefar Blossom, and obviously for this tale, front row center, I present Super Ancient Deep Sea King Coelacanth. Don't expect me to say that full name again in this video, by the way. A 2-tribute big fishy that, at the cost of a discard, could summon 4 more little fishies to your field. It was surely an interesting card, but 2-tribute monsters not named Dark Magician of Chaos were nearly unplayable at that time, as they were just too difficult to summon, let alone the question of what exactly would you even do with the potential 4 monsters King C would summon. These monsters had their effects negated and couldn't attack, so anyone having thoughts of cheeky OTKs would have their dreams dashed, at least for the time being anyways. All things considered, at that time, King C appeared to be nothing more than pack filler and was probably considered to be the absolute worst ultra rare to pull out of the entire Phantom Darkness set. With all the drawbacks of the monster, I don't think anyone outside of maybe Konami expected that the card would ever achieve greatness, and it probably wouldn't have, except as we entered the 5Ds era, every single star aligned perfectly for this card to shine. 2 sets after Phantom Darkness, Konami gave us the Duelist Genesis and the Synchro Summon in September 2008. No one thought about Coelacanth at that time, but ironically, this was the very set that gave Big Fish exactly what it needed, a premier target with a solid effect that could be summoned with its effect. Oystermeister was that target, and while it didn't alone make the concept good enough to play, the fact that it gave you a token when sent from the field to the graveyard would end up being vital to its future. This was seemingly the first major star to align that led to the creation of the Fish OTK deck. The second key fish would come in Ancient Prophecy. Fishpork Blaster had near limitless synchro summoning potential, but accessing the card for most decks wasn't easy or practical. Luckily, it was also a perfect target to be summoned with King C. The question of what to summon from King C was now answered, but there was still the issue of summoning the Great Behemoth itself. This is where the Frog partnership came into play. During 5Ds, Konami built on the success of Treeborn Frog in years prior and gave us 3 fantastic support cards that not only synergized with Treeborn, but ones that could be useful alone. First came Dupe Frog in Crimson Crisis, then Swap Frog in Stardust Overdrive, and finally Rodent Toad arrived in the Shining Darkness. These 4 frogs created the perfect mini engine to make dropping 2 tribute monsters easier than ever. While people usually associate the release of the 5Ds frogs with Frog Monarchs or Lancer Frogs, the Fish OTK deck benefited just as much and would not have been possible without them. With the release of the all-important Formula Synchron and Starstrike Blast, the deck was ready for action around November 2010. The metagame in the final years of 5Ds was kinda all over the place and was a pretty large mix of control and explosive combo decks. Triple Gateway 6 Samurai and X-Sabers could easily take you out in a single turn. On the other hand, Gravekeepers, Plant Synchro, and Gladiator Beasts were all well suited for long drawn-out grindy games. It was a time where the side deck was especially important because at a simple 8-round regional, it wasn't uncommon to play against 5 or 6 completely different meta decks, and I haven't even mentioned the highly successful Hero Beaten Lightsworn variants that often saw play. Luckily, Fish OTK benefited hugely from Cold Wave still being legal at this point. To make matters even better, the deck inherently main deck Gold Sarcophagus to search King C, but if you already had it, just like in X-Sabers, Cold Wave made an excellent second choice so that you could lock out your opponent's back row and go for game. Fish OTK was an instant hit, as Nicky Lascelles, who, side note, was basically the godfather of this deck in the TCG, achieved a top 4 finish at the deck at a regionals in Ottawa, Canada. He technically went 6-1 at the event in Swiss, but in actuality his one loss was when he 2-0'd one of his teammates and ended up giving them the win so that they could get their invite. With this event, Nicky laid out the blueprint of what Fish OTK was and how to build the deck properly. A ton of water monsters, very little defense, speed to get to your OTK pieces, and then of course the backup plan. Fish OTK ran so many unique water monsters, not just because they fueled special summons for Swap Frog, but in addition, they all could be used for draw power in conjunction with Moria Greed, which would allow you to draw 3 cards, essentially a new hand. Water monsters like Fishboard Blaster and Oystermeister were necessary in multiples for the OTK, so you had to max out on those cards. Lastly, there was even a card like Snowman Eater which was played because it was a super strong standalone card against almost all the meta. If your opponent ran into it with an 18 to 1900 attack beater like Neos Alias, Laquaria Stratos, then it was going to live and net you a nice +1. However, if your opponent used something bigger like a legendary 6 Samurai Shien, then it would trade itself for probably your opponent's best boss monster. The speed of Fish OTK came in a fairly unorthodox way. You seldomly associate Pot of Duality with an OTK deck, but it actually made a lot of sense here. The deck hardly ever OTK'd in its first turn, so Pot was really solid for digging for Swap Frog to get your Treeborn into the graveyard so you'd be able to explode in the following turns. It also was quite potent when combined with Moria Greed, as you'd be seeing 4 new cards in a single turn. Add this to the Gold Sarks that were played in the deck, and you were usually ready to go by turn 3. The last major element of Fish OTK is what I like to call the backup plan. Light and Darkness Dragon's addition to the deck was flat out brilliant. Lead was an absolute nightmare for decks filled with small monsters like 6 Samurai and Plant Synchro. He was far too big to be taken down by almost any of their main deck monsters, and usually he disrupted their lines of play so much that when they finally summoned a Synchro large enough to answer him, they had burned through half their hand or more. Lad not only gave Fish OTK an excellent way of making their opponent burn a good portion of their resources, thus making it easier to OTK later, but Light and Darkness was also incredibly easy to summon in this deck because of the Frog engine, as well as the well-known enemy controller plus Treeborn Frog, which allows you to steal your opponent's monsters and then just simply summon the Treeborn Frog back from the graveyard. The major Achilles heel of Fish OTK generally wasn't that the deck played defense poorly, it was more like the deck completely ignored defense altogether. Snowman Eater, Econ, and the limited to 1 Gore's Emissary of Darkness was about all this deck had for defending its life points. I guess that's to be expected as we're talking about an OTK deck after all. There was once this very weird build of Fish OTK that made a top 8 finish at a regionals. This build completely disregarded the deck's we don't play defense mentality. As you can see, it was super strange, and he actually went pretty heavy with defensive traps, Mirror Force, Torrential Tributes, and a full playset of Fish Depth Charge. To his credit, Fish Depth Charge appears to be a pretty versatile card, and especially was back during that era. This card allows you to tribute any fish monster you control to pop one of your opponent's cards, then draw one yourself. So not only could it be used defensively, but it could also be used as back row removal when you were ready to go for the kill. In January 2011, the deck would see multiple players take top 8 spots at regional events. The numerous OTKs the Fish deck had were, in my opinion, the coolest thing about the deck. First was the sinister and hilarious Colossal Fighter Armory Arm OTK. This devious play not only used your opponent's strongest monsters against them, but it also didn't even work unless they had one on the field and an attack position specifically. After summoning King C and a bunch of little fishies, this deck would make both Colossal Fighter and Armory Arm. Then they would equip the arm to an opponent's attack position monster, giving it 1000 attack. They would crash Colossal Fighter into the opponent's monster, and doing so triggering both the Armory Arm effect and Colossal itself. The result would be Armory Arm burning the opponent for 2800 damage, which was the attack value of the Colossal Fighter, and then the Colossal Fighter reviving itself using its effects so that they could do it 2 more times for a grand total of 8400 damage. I'd also like to point out that your opponent having a big monster on field in attack position wasn't actually required, it was just preferred. If your opponent had, for instance, like a Sangan, you'd still actually end up OTKing them. The only difference is you'd have to just make a second Armory Arm Arm, which this deck did naturally anyway throughout the progression of its combos. So even if your opponent had a monster of 1,000 to 1,500 attack, they were still going to die. The second OTK was completely different and worked well against decks like Gravekeepers or Plant Synchro that would sometimes set monsters for fear of the Colossal Fighter Armory Arm play. This OTK took advantage of how many times this deck would summon Formula Synchron in a single turn and actually would see you leave King C on the field. The play required you to summon the very random Sea Dragon Lord Gashilnoden, whose only effect was becoming 3,000 attack if a level 3 or lower monster was sent from your field to the graveyard. Fish OTK could meet that condition easily as it summoned Formula Synchron after making Sea Dragon and then went into Brionac, Dragon of the Ice Barrier, as its final monster. Your end result would be King C, Brionac, and a 3,000 attack Sea Dragon. That's 8,100 damage if you haven't been counting it, and of course that's enough for game. This play usually allowed you to bounce 3 to 4 cards on your opponent's field with Brionac, as you would draw tons of cards with your constant use of Formula Synchron. The final OTK was really obscure but worked in one situation where the others wouldn't. The Red Nova Dragon Double Armory Arm OTK allowed you to kill your opponent through Gores. If you made the read your opponent had Gores, or just somehow you knew they had it, then this was the play for you. This deck could easily make Red Nova Dragon and then have a lot more room because of Fishborg Blaster for other synchros. To pull this play off, all you needed to do was make 2 copies of Armory Arm, equipping one to the other, and then make Red Nova Dragon. Red Nova would hit the field with 2 Fishborg and 2 Formula in the graveyard, thus gaining 2,000 attack. This meant that you could attack your opponent for 5,500 damage, and when they dropped Gores, the Armory Arm would run it over, no matter what position they summoned it in, and it would inflict 2,700 damage to your opponent for a grand total of 8,200. Fascinating, right? 3 OTKs requiring completely different synchro monsters used for completely different situations. YCS Charlotte would be the true proving ground for Fish OTK, and it would be time to sink or swim. This was also going to be the first YCS of the new format, happening just 3 weeks after the new ban list went into effect. While the meta was of course still undefined so early into the new format, Six Samurai and Gravekeepers looked to be the early favorites. On March 19, 2011, YCS Charlotte began. Nikki LaSalle, who obviously was a huge fan of the deck, traveled all the way from Canada to put it up against almost 1,100 other duelists who entered the event. Day 1, he had a very arduous path as he matched up against 3 Gravekeepers in Swiss. Nikki reported that he lost every single game that his opponent opened with Royal Tribute, but luckily he went 2-1 in those 3 matchups and finished 10th after Swiss with a 9-2 record. Over the course of Swiss, Puppet Plant was a real MVP for him coming out of the side deck. Not only did it allow him to take any Six Samurai monster, but it was also excellent in the Gravekeeper matchup as well. When the dust all settled, the top 32 was overflowing with 9 Gravekeeper decks. By far the most in the top cut. Six Samurai and Hero Beat were not far behind, but as previously mentioned, Nikki made it playing Fish, alongside a young and very brash Calvin Tahan. That's right, a half-decade before he became the savior of the ABC archetype, he was running circles around duelists with Big Fish. Calvin's take on the deck wasn't that different from Nikki's. Calvin saw insane value with Caius the Shadow Monarch in the grind game. He felt like it achieved a little bit more than Light and Darkness Dragon, so he opted to play it instead. He chose to main deck only 2 trap cards, but both were simply backward removal tech cards that could open the way for OTKs. Calvin and Nikki both made it past the top 32 and top 16 round. Calvin was then matched up against Billy Break's X-Sabers in the quarterfinals. Billy made short work of Calvin as he bricked hard in game 1 and then just couldn't get started in game 2. However, Nikki took revenge in the next round against Billy and did so in both games without using any of the OTKs. The breaking point in game 2 came when Billy attacked Nikki directly with X-Saber Full Helm Knight, only to have Nikki respond by flipping over Malevolent Catastrophe to blow up all of Billy's back row and then drop a well-timed Gores in the damage step. The play was absolutely masterful. Nikki was now in the finals, and it almost felt like destiny, as before the YCS even started, head writer Jason Gerbemeyer actually gave Nikki a deck profile and talked about how unique Nikki's deck was and maybe how it could even win the entire event. Sadly, Nikki would come up just an inch short in the finals versus Sean Covert's Six Samurai deck. A perfectly timed Solemn Warning on King C was enough to doom Nikki. Despite not winning the event, in my opinion, Fish OTK proved without a doubt that it was a legitimate meta contender, not just with the respectable second place finish by Nikki, but also having Calvin Tahan reach the quarterfinals. After the riveting success the deck had in Charlotte, it would go on to have some tops on the regional level, but Fish OTK simply was not long for this world. The biggest biggest issue the deck had, and this is just my personal opinion, is that Konami simply hated the Colossal Fighter Armory Arm OTK. That one in particular, I am certain of it.
So ran extra deck's pretty much the same, but I'll make some comments on it. 2 Armory Arms. I did the Colossal Armory Arm OTK like 10 times, so this is a pretty valid win condition.
As I stated earlier, that OTK actually punished your opponent for going into their boss monsters and having something on the field that was strong at all. I believe that Konami didn't approve of the message that this specific OTK conveyed. Basically, summon your boss monster and you're going to lose because of it. Regardless of my theory, Konami took drastic action against this play well before the next ban list. In the Turbo Pack 6 booster pack, they reprinted and errated Armory Arm to say, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attack of the destroyed monster in the graveyard. This change meant that if the monster didn't remain in the graveyard to be verified by Armory Arm, then the burn effect wouldn't trigger. This 100% killed the bread and butter OTK of the Fish OTK deck, which obviously severely crippled it. As bad as that was, Konami wasn't done as they doubled down on the next ban list. On the September 2011 FNL list, they outright banned Fishborg Blaster and Giant Trunade. Now the deck had no way of synchro summoning at all, and also couldn't address massive amounts of back row. This of course translated into the deck being completely unplayable and falling off of the planet. There would be one more shocking top a year later at YCS Providence during the Zexal era with an XC version of the deck, but this one didn't synchro summon at all and was more of kind of like a one-hit wonder fluky type deal. Anyways, we are now at the conclusion of our Yu-Gi-Oh story. If you enjoyed the video, or more importantly, if you learned anything, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like this one.
No hard feelings about the harpoon incident, right? Get bent, you freaky fish guy. I am not a freaky fish guy.